Hi, welcome to the second lecture of our semester. This lecture focuses on the material that you read from Plato and from Aristotle. When I was little, one of the myths that I enjoyed the most was that of Prometheus. So when I found it in my readings for social and political philosophy, it was really exciting to see that someone like Socrates had actually had a discussion about what this myth was. But obviously you have to wonder what the reason is that a myth is being brought into the mix. So that's sort of what I'm going to try to explain to you today, that coupled with the couple of pages we read from Aristotle's Politics. So here we go. This is a painting by Raphael called The School of Athens, and in it he represents the agora, or the marketplace, which is where apparently Socrates used to go and have conversations with people. Some of the people he talked to were sophists, who are known in the history of philosophy as people who did rhetoric, people who taught others how to win arguments, but not necessarily to know things. They were teachers in the skill of argumentation, but not teachers in the sense that they actually had knowledge. So Raphael in this painting has put a lot of people from ancient Greece, but apparently some people have discussed that there's also like Leonardo da Vinci is there, and other people from the Renaissance. But the reason why Raphael paints this scene is so that he can address the sort of intellectual development that was happening in ancient Greece in the 300 before Christ era. So we have very important developments at that time. We have the pre-Socratics, who, as you can imagine, are named, or they're like grouped together because they were alive and theorizing before Socrates came. So some of the pre-Socratics are Anaxagoras, Anaximenes, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras. Parmenides had really interesting ideas about what it means to exist in reality, but the two that you might be familiar with are Heraclitus and Pythagoras. Heraclitus was a historian, and if any of you have seen 300, that movie is loosely based on some of the accounts of Sparta that Heraclitus wrote. And then Pythagoras, who all of those who love math adore, and all of us who fear math kind of find him at guilt for not giving us an easy time when we were trying to study what a triangle is, right? Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras are said to be some of the major influences on Socrates' thought. And I'll talk a little bit about Socrates in a second. Just like the painting, right, represents these people plus Plato and Aristotle. At the center of the painting we have these two key figures. The one on the left raising his index to the heavens, that's supposed to be Socrates, and the one on the left sort of placing his hand on a direction that's more grounded, that would be Aristotle, and that represents the different philosophical perspectives that they had. Socrates believed that everything that exists can be explained from a perspective of what exists in the heavens, or in a metaphysical sense, and Aristotle believed that everything that exists can be explained by paying attention to nature as it is. So just to continue with the introduction of these thinkers, they're going to be fundamental in the building of Western societies and of philosophy as we know it right now. Plato and Socrates play a very important role in the early development of Christianity, because Christian theologians look at this idea that everything can be explained in a metaphysical way as an idea that actually aligns with their own purposes. And then Aristotle is later on recovered by Aquinas, and Aquinas, one of the four pillars in Catholic thought, is going to think that what Aristotle said is exactly what Catholic doctrine has been trying to prove all this time. We're going to hear a little bit more from Aquinas in our next discussion. The movie that we're going to be using, City of God, actually is reminiscent of one of the most important books written by Aquinas. So we have some biographical information on Socrates. He is famous for coining the question or the aphoristic supposition, the unexamined life is not worth living, therefore talking about how human life is not only supposed to be spent in daily activities, but there has to be something more to it. There has to be this enjoyment, this understanding that we have a purpose. He was around 1469 to 399, we believe, like years more or left. The Oracle of Delphi told him that he was the wisest man alive, and that he needed to go and spread his knowledge, to which Socrates replied that he wasn't the wisest man alive. Therefore he went to the Agora to have conversations with people who he considered were really smart. One of those conversations is what Plato recorded in the Protagoras, which is a conversation precisely with a sophist by the name Protagoras. So Socrates would go and try to find these people and ask them questions and ask them to provide an absolutely defined and refined answer for that which he was investigating. So with Protagoras, you can see from the myth that the question is, what is the art of citizenship? What makes a citizen good? And in order to explain that question, they come up with, let's talk about the myth of Epimetheus and Prometheus. We don't know of any work written by Socrates. We know of Socrates and of his work because of these three people. Aristophanes was a comedian, Xenophon was a historian, and Plato is said to have been his disciple. Aristophanes makes fun of Socrates in one of his comedies. It's called The Clouds, and he places Socrates way up high in a cloud, just looking at people and making fun of them in a way that Socrates doesn't really connect with people, and he's lost in his own thought. Since its inception, that idea has been the companion to philosophers everywhere. Everybody sees philosophers that are lost in a different world and not really connected to this one. And I think that might be true of some disciplines, but definitely is not true when we talk about ethics or when we talk about social and political philosophy. The kinds of theories that we're trying to present are theories that are very much applicable to life and are very much derived from what we see in life. Xenophon is the one who allows us to see Socrates as an actual person. He talks about how Socrates fought in the Peloponnesian Wars. He was what we would say now a private. He didn't have a rank, a higher rank, but he was definitely someone who was recognized in battle for being courageous. So we get that information from Socrates, from Xenophon about Socrates. And then Plato is said to be Socrates' student, but we don't really know to which degree that is true. So this painting is The Death of Socrates, and if you ever go to the Met here in New York, you can see it. It's absolutely gorgeous. But you have Socrates in the middle, again raising his finger up, he has been condemned to death because, according to his to the people who opposed them, he was guilty of corrupting the youth for making them question the things in which the Greeks believed. He was guilty of not believing in the gods of the Greeks, and he was guilty for charging for an education and not being really geared towards education. So after Socrates is condemned, he spends 21 days in his jail waiting for his sentence to be fulfilled. The sentence will be that he drinks the hemlock, which is poison. So here you see that the poison is being given to him. He's going to take it by his own hand, which brings up the philosophical question: did Socrates commit suicide, or was he really sentenced by the state? If you read the Apology, this would make way more sense than what I'm saying right now. But if you see that figure at the foot of the bed looking in the other direction, in his own dialogue, the Phaedrus from which this image is taken, Plato presents himself that way. Plato presents himself as a distant character, someone who was sort of acquainted with Socrates, but maybe Socrates didn't know who he was. So that means that when we get to Plato's biography, we talk about when he was around, and the dates do overlap with when Socrates was around. Plato would have been really, really young when Socrates was condemned, and young around his 20s, right? Which for Greece was old enough, but not old enough for Socrates to actually have been around Plato that much. So anyway, we know him as a student and chronicler of Socrates. He is the one who writes all the Platonic dialogues because he was so infatuated and he thought that the figure of Socrates was that important. He was an Athenian citizen of high status. He was a military man. He was a strategist. He was asked to be one of the 30 tyrants of Athens, and he declined. So in Plato we have maybe the most positive influence that Socrates ever had on someone. And he obviously has influenced major thinkers of every age in Western culture, to the degree that a lot of people say that all philosophy is a footnote to what Plato wrote. He wrote on every branch of philosophy, and you kind of see that just from the excerpt on the Protagoras, but we'll talk more about that later. Aristotle was not an Athenian citizen. He was actually born in Macedonia, which means that he didn't have the status that Socrates or Plato had. And when he writes about the slave, he is in a middle ground position, because he's not a slave, but he's also not a citizen. So he sees all these interactions from sort of a politically disembodied perspective. This is going to come up later on, but knowing that he's from Macedonia, we should always remember that Aristotle ended up being a mentor to Alexander the Great, who is the Greek who is going to conquer Persia. He was a logician, an ethicist, a scientist. He specialized on biology, and when it comes to ethics and social and political thought, he thinks that's the core of what we should study. And he was a student of Plato. They were together in the academy, and then they had a fight because Aristotle thought that everything has to do with what we can experience, and Plato followed in the footsteps of Socrates, believing that there's a beyond. So in a second I'll continue in another bit with this lecture.